Please welcome our moderator, Bloomberg New Energy Finance Chief Content Officer, Nathaniel Bullard, and his panelists, President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Jin-Li Chun, CEO of Swedbank Robur, Liza Johnson, founding and managing partner of Inclusive Capital Partners, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, and CEO and Executive Director of Temasek Holdings, Dylan Pillay Sandasegra.
For the first time all day, my glasses are not fogged up. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our session today. You may have noticed that we have a few sessions about climate on the agenda. By my count, we have 6 of them today, one way or another in the plenary. And if we think about the word climate and how it has appeared in discussion, it has been in, as far as I can tell, every single session that has happened on the main stage. It has come up. So there may be something there, shall we say. There may be something that we need to talk about. But I think a useful thing to do before we dig in further, and we're going to be looking specifically at the finance aspect of this, is to do a polling question. So get your phones out, everyone. Get ready. I'm going to ask a question, which we're going to then mull over as a group here, and then we'll get the responses out. Could I have the polling question, please? So, how much of climate finance actually translates into greenwashing? This is a bit provocational, but that's on purpose. Is it the majority of the finance that we've been talking about of late? Is it too much of it, but still we're making substantive difference? Or not at all? Are the majority of firms that we're talking to when we talk about climate actually taking real action? So, take a moment, answer that question, and then I, in turn, am going to sort of work my way through the discussion up here. Liza, I'm going to start with you. So I want to sort of get a sense, the state of play. Like, what would you say is the state of climate finance right now? We've got quite a lot of commitment needed to be done to reach the sort of global targets that have come out of COP21 in Paris, COP26 just this last month. What is our state of play in making a green transition, if there is indeed one happening?
There's absolutely one happening. I think we've got a good framework in the Glasgow Pact, but now it's up to us, the finance industry and the corporations, to make the real difference. And if you look at the Glasgow Net Zero Asset Alliances, there are several ones. We actually comprise of 425 asset management companies and insurance companies and the likes, comprising 130 trillion. That's 40% of the investable capital in the world. And most of us actually made promises to our clients that this is how we will invest their money. So yes, we are making a difference, and we will make a difference.
I'd like to hear that. President Jin, welcome. I'd like to throw that same question to you. What is, do you think, in your mind, the state of climate finance and making a green transition possible at the moment? How would you classify that?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the amount of financing needed for us to achieve the target of 1.5 degrees goal is enormous. And the numbers may differ from different, researchers, institutions, or governments, but roughly we can say $50 trillion would be needed by 2050 to reach the objective. So this is a huge amount of resources, and obviously both the public sector and the private sector and our multilateral development banks would have to work together. So where does the money come from? I think if this is really, the climate change risk is really considered something bordering on existential threat to the human society, and the allocation or reallocation of resources is a must. And I believe it is possible as long as the international consensus is there and if the commitment is there. So We believe the COP26 meeting in Glasgow is a very important step forward. And I think something has to be done to translate the pledges and the commitments into reality. And we in the Multilateral Development Bank's family are very much committed. We have a joint statement announced by David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, indicating that the multilateral development banks would work together. So all in all, I think the amount needed is huge, but it all depends on the political commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lynn, what do you think the state of play is for us?
I would not want to say that there is greenwashing going on intentionally.
Right.
I trust the people who have signed the GFANS document. I trust the Climate Action 100. I trust the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, the individuals who are truly committed to using their money and their financial power to green our planet. So, but, and in a way, a friend of mine said, nothing matters before the but.
Right.
So the but, so that's all the nice.
Those are the niceties, so here comes, right.
But if we want the financial markets to do their job, the markets are smart, and the markets need a price on carbon. And I think the most important role that government can play, and for that matter, the most important role that any of us can play in our positions of advocacy, is to place a price on carbon. Because then the market has certainty, and the market has a price so that the new technologies, the carbon capture, the blue and green hydrogen, the biomass, all those things that we know are the big solutions can be financed. And so I think short of a price on carbon, we are not going to see the most efficient movement of capital toward the goal of, as they said in Glasgow, keeping 1.5 alive.
Keeping 1.5 alive indeed. Thank you, Lynn. Dilhan.
So I would agree with what Lynn has said, but maybe I would just add on to what President Jin was talking about as well. I think for global finance to really have an impact on what we need to do to achieve 1.5 degrees requires partnership and collaboration between different sources of capital. And those different sources of capital coming together can allow us to address the many different dimensions that are required to get us into 1.5 degrees, whether it's decarbonization solutions, whether it's a transition from brown to green, whether it's about providing capital and financing options. All these require collaboration. So on one hand, by governments in the context of public finance, multilateral development banks and agencies, to allow for policy frameworks to come into, especially for emerging markets. For private capital, people like sovereign wealth funds and pension funds and other investors, to corporates, because they play an important role for that as well. Philanthropic organizations, as they are a provider of concessionary capital, all of these have to come together. And I want to say something about what Lynn said. I agree with her that we need to price carbon. And the reason why we need to price carbon is because you need to know the true cost of capital of your business model. The issue of physical risk and transition risk converge. And for transition risk, the question is, what is the true cost? What's the true cost of capital for your business model, not now, but in 10 years' time or 15 years' time? And that's why the price of carbon is important. But the price of carbon needs to be put in place in a way that doesn't work only as a disincentive.
Right.
Okay? It has to be an incentive for people to be able to invest in the solutions which are required. It has to be a disincentive from folks having to continue to do what they're doing without being part of the transition story, without thinking about the carbon intensity of business models. It also has to be an incentive for emerging markets, where there is this huge dichotomy and challenge between the need to provide resources for urbanization to bring communities into a better life as against the need to have a greener planet. So there is an element there as well.
I think that's very well spotted. If it's a pure disincentive, it's not really going to drive the scale of the $100 trillion, give or take, that you need to deeply decarbonize most of the transport, power, industrial sectors that we have right now. One moment, because I'm going to say, first of all, please send us some questions. And I want to go see our quiz questions up and see how we did. Could I pull up the results? Let's see. Not bad. This is kind of what we were talking about in the green room. We're probably going to end up with too much, but it's still making a difference. The not much at all, majority of firms taking real action, that's a pleasure to see. The majority is, I think, still too high for our liking, but I think we can settle on we're okay if there's a bit too much greenwashing, but we're still making a difference. Lisa, you had something that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think everybody agrees on the carbon tax, but I also think there's no time to waste. We can't wait for it, and we can't keep sitting here asking for the governments to do more. Mm-hmm. So I think it's time for us. I mean, we're in this room, and people are listening. We're in charge of a lot of the capital of the world, so we can start acting. And people also concluded that money is smart. We're smart. We can look ahead. We can make those estimates. And as Minister Rania from Egypt said before, this is everybody's responsibility. So we can't just push it on to the governments. It's time that we start acting on the facts that we have today.
Indeed. Then you wanted to add something.
I think that's very true. And I think another aspect of a price on carbon for governments to consider is that the burden of that price can't go on the working and middle classes. So there's a proposal in the United States for a carbon dividend, so that it's really the wealthy and the shareholders who will pay the brunt of the cost on carbon, and that society will step in to take care of the people for whom that extra cost for electricity or transport is too much for them. So it actually is being viewed as a progressive idea. And I should add, over 70 countries have some price, including China, on carbon already. Whether it's the right price can be debated, but at least people are on the road to a price. And I think that's important. There is a proposal now before Congress in the United States, the Wyden Amendment, which is one vote away from a carbon price. It's a very important
It's an important vote, so it's also very far away, at one vote away.
Very far away. But
Johan.
So I would agree with Lynn that there's a need for us to consider the impact of climate change and transition on society. Mm-hmm. And there's a social cost to transition, especially if you're thinking about the transition of business models, the disruption to a particular sector, and it really relates to workforce transition as well. Okay, so when you think about carbon taxes and the receipt of carbon taxes, quite apart from a carbon dividend that you were talking about, I think the question is, what would you do with those tax receipts? How will that go towards addressing the impact of climate change transition on society? Okay, so a number of dimensions, one of which is what you mentioned, Lynn, which is the increased costs and the burden to the middle income and even lower middle income. But the other part has to do with the fact that we have to make sure in the transition, everyone gets pulled along into a better world, that there is, in fact, a climate dividend as well. And I think that is a big issue, because if you're thinking about the transition, the benefits come later, the cost is borne first.
Right.
And there's a need to address that cost as well. And if you think about the return to society in the longer run as a result of climate change, because you have to take the view that climate change is a good for society and for global society as a whole, then who bears that cost up front? That's an important question to ask.
Thank you. President Jin, from your perspective, are we adequately pricing risk, and are we adequately considering who bears these costs for making such big transitions?
Thank you very much for the question. But let me pick up the
Yes, please.
points my panelists raised. Carbon taxation, carbon price. I do believe that it is necessary for the consumers to know that there's a price for the energy. And it must have a kind of, sense that we need to pay. But the issue is how to handle the tax receipts. Of course, we should allocate the resources for the investment in the renewables. And taxation is one thing, whether it should fall equally on all of the people, regardless of their income, that could be discussed. But I do agree with Evelyn, Lynn, that probably we should have differentiation and differentiate the burdens. But I would like to highlight the point. When we talk about the amount of resources needed, we have to make a distinction between the investments in the renewable projects and in the R&D, which would help us achieve technological breakthrough. My view is probably given the current technology, windmill and the solar panel, and there's a huge room for efficiency gains in the future. And at this moment, I think efficiency is still very much limited. So we certainly on the development banks, we cannot invest in some of the new technology. We're only investing in projects with proven technology because we are not venture capitalists. But it is important for the regulators, governments to think about incentives to the investment in R&D. Without sufficient investment in R&D, we just repeat this kind of low efficient renewable projects forever. So that is why I think it's very much important. That is why when you highlight the importance of tax price carbon and the levy carbon taxations, a more important crucial issue is how you most effectively use the resources raised from the taxation. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. I think that this is actually very critically important. I would not call our current technologies solved in terms of what they can do, but they've given a sense of problems that are solvable. Certainly we can deploy capital in the tens of trillions of dollars towards the things that we know work, and we can scale them. But there are not only benefits and things to be gained and extracted from our current technologies by developing them further, but also a lot of sectors that we really don't address yet at all that are way beyond power and way beyond road transport. So things like decarbonizing the process of making cement and steel, aviation, heavy shipping, things like this, where you run into things that are chemistry problems in some cases, and you run into agency problems in others. So how do we move collectively here towards deploying capital that is constructive, both develops new technologies, but also solves problems, like gets things in motion? And I'm curious, any of you on the panel who would like to jump in on that? Dilhan, I see your hand.
I think Lynn will.
Oh, Lynn's first? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, ladies first.
No, age before beauty.
And definitely.
Which is true. Now, what I was going to say was the great advantage of the price on carbon is the lever that it gives to the development of more technology. So if you take carbon capture, and a lot of the technologies, we know how to make blue hydrogen, we know how to make green hydrogen, we know how to do biomass, but none of it is economic. No one will pay for it because once it replaces the fossil fuel, whether it's fossil fuel in cement or steel or turning our electricity and so forth on, as long as we're not paying for that, then there's not an economic incentive to invest in the big solutions. We have an economic incentive to invest in wind and solar. So from 1992 to 2019, wind and solar went from 0% of energy to 3%. In 2020, it increased by 20% solar, and that means it'll double in 4 years. And wind increased by 17%, so it'll double in 6 years.
And with a cost decrease of 90% as well.
With a cost increase, but at the end of the day, that's going to only be 30% of, so in 2 decades, it'll be 30% of our needs. So if we don't turbocharge the big solutions, like carbon capture can really help the planet. And that technology is inside of oil and gas companies. They're the ones who know how to do that, but it doesn't cost $50 a ton, it costs $100 a ton. But it begins to become investable, either because you say, I'm going to do it, even if I lose money, and I think you'll see some companies doing that. But imagine if we had the lever of the capital markets, where the return was actually there for these investments. So it's not a lack of science and technology and innovation. It's a lack of economics, and in return, it's a lack of political will. So if the politicians could garner the will to place a price, then the market could solve the problem.
I'm curious, what's going to make a politician make that decision? Like, what's going to inspire that? And because I think this is a capital markets discussion, but it all has to run back through politics and policy. Like, what might inspire that change? Is there something happening now? Is there something that could happen in the future to make that change effective? Ilhan.
Well, I wouldn't want to venture into what goes into a politician's mind. That'd be very dangerous.
It's fair enough.
But maybe I'll just say something. It's just follow up on what President Jin said. I think that governments need to be upfront with the population as to what it really means to do the transition.
Okay.
And remember, it's a journey. Okay, if you want to get to 2050, it's 29 years from now. Doesn't mean that we wait for the last 5 years. We start now, but it's a journey. And as you go along, you know, the cost curve, the carbon abatement cost curve should come down if you see an acceleration of capital being deployed. Now, what does it take to have that capital being deployed at that accelerated pace? Well, you need breakthroughs, first of all, but you need an incentive. That's where governments come in, to provide the framework for an incentive, whatever that means. It could be grants, it could be part of the carbon tax, et cetera, but you need an incentive. You know, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, Bill Gates' firm, took money from a bunch of very wealthy people, and he said to them, well, you're putting money in here, but don't expect to make money from it. But they've invested in a number of decarbonization solutions and are actually, on the face of it, generating returns. So even though you are deploying capital as a force for good, there is that opportunity of making the returns, but it will not be in the normal time frame of a typical venture capital investment or typical growth equity investment that you'll be looking for. So you have to be prepared to put capital down for a longer gestation period to get the results. You have to be prepared to be able to take some zeros in the portfolio that you're investing in. And you've got to be prepared to invest even when, as President Jin said, it's not investable by a number of other people, which means TRLs 1 to 6, you know, that's technology readiness levels. And there are currently companies who are engaged in solutions for decarbonization of the cement process, because it's the third largest emitter of CO2, 8%. And for steel, from blast furnacing to electric arc furnacing, for example, and that's 5% of carbon emissions. There's more money going to sustainable aviation fuels. Rolls-Royce has said by 2023, all the engines will be compatible with sustainable aviation fuel. And if you own an airline like we do, you're not going to reduce emissions by the most efficient aircraft. That will maybe get you 25, 30%. It's about sustainable aviation fuel. But that requires policy making, but it requires a number of people coming together. It's, you know, who bears the cost of aviation air travel? It has to be a shared cost. Yes. It can't be just on the airline, otherwise you won't have any way of traveling from one place to another except by ship. It's got to be airports, it's got to be the individual, but you need to have the solutions out there. So let me just say something about private capital. There's a lot of private capital available. If you look at GFANZ and look at the number of net zero commitments made, $140 odd trillion, right? You take 1% of that, that's 1.4 trillion. Now, if investors are basing returns on, say, 5 or 6% for the rest of the decade, okay, taking 1% and looking at the remainder, compounding at 5 or 6%, you can definitely afford to put that into things that matter for climate change transition. Okay, so the question for investors is how much of your capital are you prepared to make risk-based? Not risk capital, everything is risk capital, okay,
right.
when you're allocating capital, risk-based capital. What President Jin talked about, R&D. Because if you're really thinking about solutions that matter in the long run, you have to invest today to get those benefits in any event.
Definitely. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, it's just two comments. I completely agree with you, Dylan. There are, you mentioned politicians
Yes.
who dares to go first. And I mean, if I look at the European Union, they're considering a greenhouse gas emission tax on shipping, for instance, to actually start transitioning that huge industry that really needs to push forward. But and then going back to Dylan's comment, it's about the commitments. And we have those 130 trillion in the net zero alliances. And committing to those, you actually sign up to publicly declaring your goals. And it's easy to follow trail. We put a goal on how much we will actually put in renewable energy, how much we need to invest of our portfolio in order to be in line with the international LNG, their trajectories. So if everybody did that, then we do have a large chunk of capital going into those areas that desperately need it. But it's about setting those goals and following it up. And with the transparency we're starting to see, hopefully the notion or the feeling of greenwashing will actually be a memory as people start acting.
Let's hope so, certainly. Do you see within the corporate world that enhanced commitment? I mean, I see from the very early stage, to what Dylan mentioned, quite a lot of appetite. But do we see the sense that this is not just something that should be done, but importantly, I think, an element of growth? Do you see this? Yeah,
and it is happening. If we looked at our portfolio, we manage about $220 billion US. So we looked at our capital a year ago, and 12% of our asset under management actually had science-based targets that were approved. If we look at that same portfolio today, or where we're invested, it's actually 26%. And that movement is just in 1 year. And we're meeting a lot of the companies. We're investing in 70 markets, 3,000 companies, and we talk to our companies every year. And the interest is huge. And the ones that haven't set targets, they're really curious about how to.
Right.
So I think the moment is there. It's coming.
So doubling essentially the amount of commitment in 1 year.
Yeah.
And what's next year going to be, do you think?
I don't know, but by 2030, our goal is to have 60% of the companies in which we invest committed to science-based targets or alike, something similar. I mean, this is developing. It's an emerging thing. It's probably going to be better metrics. Everything is improving by the year. And by 2030, 100% of our companies needs to have climate targets.
Fantastic. President Jin, I'm curious how you think of things such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative, committing in a dedicated way to meeting the Paris Agreement on a portfolio basis. I'm curious if things like that, from your perspective, a multilateral perspective, are also meaningful. Do they move your investment thesis and your investment priorities?
Thank you. As you know, ours is a new bank, and we are only 6 years into operation.
Yes.
But from the very beginning, we made it very much clear the bank is lean, clean, and green. We promote green economy. We finance the transition to low carbon, eventually to net zero. But as you know, our financial resources are limited, and the combined resources of the World Bank, ADB, EBRD, and all those multilateral different banks are limited. So what we need to do is to provide some guidance to the developing borrowing members to indicate how they should allocate resources for the green economy. So I think that's the kind of leverage. It's not just the financial leverage, it's also the moral leverage. So we think it's very much important. For instance, when I declared that we are not going to finance any coal-fired power plants 2 years ago, I think it served as a very clear message that the model of development banks like ours will only promote green economy. And as I said, the joint declaration by the multilateral development banks can also help the borrowing countries to understand that they need to work with all these financiers in a way which can accelerate their transition to low carbon and net zero. So the role of our banks and MDBs is to serve as the guidance. It's not the real resources we can provide to make a difference. It's very much limited. And I think we need to work with the private sector. The vast private sector resources could be tapped and in a way which we can all work together to finance the climate change mitigation and adaptation. Now, when we promote ESG, when the financial institutions and the business companies all understand their social responsibility to promote the fast transition, I think it's important for us to mobilize more resources for that purpose. I think it would be a silent moral persuasion, so that people who don't do it would have to follow suit. So this is something I think is very much important. And another issue I think we need to deal with is the cooperation among the political leaders, elected political leaders, the multilateral development banks, public sector institutions, and the private sector. The elected political leaders have term limits. They have 4 years, 5 years, and how could we make sure that they will look at the public interests beyond their term limits? I think certainly it is very good to make pledges to fight against climate change, but how to handle the consequences of probably some impact, short-term impact on the people's lives. So I think it's very much important to make sure this would be handled well. And in France, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jackets incident, also tells us how important it is not to do something which would cause the backlash against this push for green economy. And for the private sector institutions, particularly financial institutions, I think the pressure would be mounting for them to direct the resources for the renewables. But there's again an issue of how these institutions will be able to sustain themselves as the financial institutions. So it is very important for them to identify very good projects, profitable projects, and sometimes you see so much money chase so few good deals. So there are so many issues I think we only need to work out by working together with each and every one's special responsibility. But the international cooperation in a broad sense, in my view, is very, very important.
Thank you, President Jin, and we are actually coming right up against time, I'm afraid. But I want to say, I think we've hit all of the right points on what needs to be done. I really quite enjoy the notion of moral suasion, which I think is actually very important, but also the growing sense on a portfolio basis, on a technology basis, on a policy basis, ideally, that we are moving in the right direction. I look forward to us having this conversation 5 years from now and seeing both a back test, seeing what we've been surprised by on the upside, where we have more work to do. So thank you very much, all of you in the audience, for joining this conversation, and thank you to everyone here on the stage. And with that, we're finished. Thank you.